You're listening to the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. I'm Aaron Goodman. I'm a journalist, documentary maker, and researcher, and I'm also someone who's lived with multiple chemical sensitivity, or MCS, for years. MCS is also called chemical intolerance, toxicant-induced loss of tolerance, or TILT, and idiopathic environmental illness, and it affects millions around the world. It's a condition that makes everyday life extremely challenging and unpredictable. Fragrance, air fresheners, fresh paint, scented laundry products on someone's clothing, and a lot more can trigger exhaustion, brain fog, muscle pain, rashes, and a wide range of symptoms. And yet, for all its impacts, MCS remains largely invisible. Doctors dismiss it, employers rarely accommodate it, even friends and family struggle to understand. The Chemical Sensitivity Podcast aims to change that. We dive into the latest research, share real stories, and explore how people navigate life with an illness many refuse to see. This is a special episode in which I'm exploring listeners' important questions. Before we dive in, just a couple of things. You can find the podcast's new Facebook group online. Just search for the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. And if you feel the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast has helped you in some way and made you feel more informed or less alone, I'd love your input. I'm running a short listener survey to understand how the podcast can better support the MCS community. The link is in the show notes, and you can also find it on posts in the Facebook group. Thanks so much for your support. I really want to hear from you, and thanks for being part of it. As always, you can reach me at aaron@chemicalsensitivitypodcast.com. All right, so let me explore the first question. The first question comes from Eun-Hae Lee, and the question is, how to survive when living in a country where almost no one has heard about MCS and family members who live separately hardly believe it or take it seriously enough, so I don't get the help I need, and I am denied basic necessities and healthcare when I can't get them myself. The second question comes from Eun-Hae Lee, and it is how to survive when I'm locked in a tiny unit of a toxic complex and can't pass in the shared hallway that's constantly filled with fragrances from people who pass all day nonstop. And how can I survive? Because I can't open the window to breathe real clean air. Well, it's complicated, and a few listeners have shared some thoughts. From Therese M. Atala, Therese writes, the million-dollar question, quote, how to remain as safe as possible, having MCS and not in a safe place. So from my perspective, she writes, everyone deserves to be as safe as possible from the constant exposures to toxins that permeate the air, and how to achieve that really requires some complicated action. Aviva Moses Hawate Kawar writes, surviving in a tiny unit with constant exposure is tough. Consider documenting incidents and presenting them to management or even local authorities to raise awareness about the severity of chemical sensitivity and its impacts on residents' health. Maybe that could lead to some policy changes. ? And anonymous member 283 writes, in the long term, move. In the short term, wear an air purifier or use an air purifier inside the unit, a mask and a trench coat and a hat in the hallway, get out daily for fresh air, and sadly trying to get accommodations at a rental unit, if that's the case, may only lead to retaliation or false eviction. Get in contact with others to brainstorm your options. And I think that's a great point. We do find a lot of benefit by sharing our questions with other people with MCS on various platforms online, and I encourage you to do that as well. And I think I have one more comment for you. This comment comes from Cheryl Martin. She writes, I'm not sure how to answer, so I thought I would just give a list of possible helpful suggestions. Number one, a window fan that can exhaust air out. These not only help with removing any offending scents, but can create a negative air effect if needed. A high-quality air purifier with pounds of carbon, a respirator or carbon mask for wearing when you leave the apartment, seal every nook and cranny where scent could potentially infiltrate your space. And this includes all of your baseboards, light fixtures and plugs, and any vents such as bathroom vents. And find a way to seal the door that leads into the hallway. Often there is a sizable gap at the bottom of the door. And I also find that a good-sized fan can be helpful when my neighbor does his laundry. I aim it at the wall where I can smell the scent. The next question is from Tanya Gilula. My question also relates to safe housing, but I want to know how people travel if you're not in your own vehicle. Listening to your podcast, I hear you and other people travel. How do you do that? The actual travel is hugely difficult with the airport and the planes, the transportation, and finding somewhere safe to stay. Rental cars and taxi cabs are killers for me. I'm way more sensitive than most. I know to call hotels and find out if they're spraying the fragrances in the air systems because I have had that happen and we've had to change hotels. I've signed up for safe housing groups, but none seem safe enough to stay at. And I've quizzed Airbnb places and their laundry and cleaners about their laundry, cleaners, and products in the houses, and the houses turn out to be harmful. I've gone from traveling the world to barely leaving my house. I want to be able to travel again. Any help and advice would be greatly appreciated. So in response to this question, I think we could devote an entire episode to the question of travel. So I could just speak about my own experience is that, yeah, travel is very difficult. It has been very difficult for me. I have done it, but it takes a lot of planning. As Tanya writes, I've ruled out hotels. Hotels are no longer possible for me, any hotel, because of air fresheners and laundry products. So, for example, my wife and kids took a fairly long trip, and we used rented Airbnbs. And each Airbnb, it is a matter of sending detailed questions about the products they use. And I request that they don't use any fragrances or pesticides prior to the visit, including laundry products. We bring our own bedding so they can remove that, and towels. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. And sometimes I don't travel a lot, but there have been times when it's, as I say, it hasn't worked and I've been sick for the entire duration of the trip daily. And it's been a challenge. Yeah, it's usually a challenge. It usually never really works out that well. Rental cars, extremely difficult. I found certain companies better than others, and I always call ahead and ask them not to spray air fresheners. Doesn't always work. Mostly never works. Yeah, and airplanes, trains are very difficult. I found in North America, particularly because of the bathroom products that are used on Amtrak. And any travel, for me, and probably for others, it depends who you're next to. And so sitting next to someone using fragrance can ruin a trip and make it very difficult. So let's go to the next question. And again, I welcome any feedback about travel. Here's a question. Which countries recognize MCS as a disability? So from what I've found, there are a small number of countries that recognize multiple chemical sensitivity as a disability. This doesn't necessarily mean that people in these countries are guaranteed to find doctors who have any knowledge about it or get accommodation. But if we're talking about MCS being recognized as a disability, yes, Canada at the federal level and in at least 2 provinces, Ontario and Quebec, Australia, Germany, Austria, Denmark, Luxembourg, Spain, Finland, Japan, Spain, Italy, period. If you live in any of these countries and you'd like to share feedback about whether I have this right, and if MCS is in fact recognized in your countries, does it make any difference in your day-to-day? It may be recognized as a disability under anti-discrimination laws, for example, but again, it may be recognized medically, but that often doesn't translate into being able to access healthcare or accommodations. But connected to that question, Lakshmi Kura sends in the following question. Do hospitals have ways to protect people with MCS? Several listeners shared helpful responses. The first is from Anne Brown. Anne Brown writes, yes, they are obligated to accommodate and protect people with MCS. Anne Brown writes, they'll fight us, gaslight us, they'll even verbally abuse us, but ultimately they are required to accommodate our needs. Anne Brown is based in Western Canada in the province of British Columbia. And Ang writes, and it continues to write, if anyone in British Columbia is having difficulty being accommodated by our British Columbia medical facilities, please reach out to her, as I've been requesting accommodations in our healthcare environments for 16 years and would love to help. It's very generous of you. A lot of experience. Cheryl E. Martin, previous listener that we had a response from, writes, it's a good question. I don't believe so. I had to fight for an accommodation for treatment in a hospital in Ontario in Canada that was not fragrance-free. Every province varies, and though there are several fragrance-free hospitals across Canada, it would still be important to let them know in advance that you have MCS and any specific requirements. Okay, so another listener in Ontario, Canada, Yvette Caro, writes, I am in Ontario and unfortunately have been to many hospitals over the years, and they do not accommodate at all. I've had such horrible experiences. Pia Renee in Australia writes, in Australia, I was in multiple hospitals in 2021, despite telling staff every 2 hours that my allergy was perfume. The man in the cubicle beside me was still allowed to spray deodorant each day, and it filled the ward. We have a very important question from Dennis or Denis Martin. The question is, how do people develop MCS if it's not from mold? Great question. And in answering this question, I'm going to turn to an important 2021 academic paper by Dr. Claudia Miller and Professor Shahir Masri, who's been on the podcast, who co-wrote a paper titled Toxicant-Induced Loss of Tolerance for Chemicals, Foods, and Drugs, Assessing Patterns of Exposure Behind a Global Phenomenon. And so in this paper, the researchers investigate the origins and mechanisms of what they prefer to call chemical intolerance. And they also propose a two-stage process known as toxicant-induced loss of tolerance, or TILT. So what is TILT? TILT, according to the research, is a two-stage process where people develop what they refer to as TILT, chemical intolerance, MCS. The first stage involves initiation or exposure to chemicals over time or in one episode. And toxicant could include pesticides, solvents, or indoor air contaminants. And then the stage 2 is characterized by what we refer to again as the illness that we have, where we react to numerous toxins or chemicals that likely didn't previously bother us, including chemicals, foods, and medication. So what's interesting in this paper to me, beyond the description of the TILT theory, is, what Dennis or Denis is asking, how do people get this illness? It doesn't just come out of the blue. It doesn't happen to everyone, but the researchers identify some common exposure events. And those are subpopulations, people who experience exposures who developed the illness at relatively the same time. For example, there were workers at the Environmental Protection Agency headquarters in the United States who were exposed to new products. I believe it was carpet inside the building. Gulf War veterans, casino workers who were exposed to pesticide, workers who were exposed to aircraft oil fumes, people who were exposed to chemicals and toxic pollution after the World Trade Center tragedy, people who've had surgical implants, mold as well, and tunnel workers who were exposed to solvents. So those are 8 major exposure events where the researchers have shown a pattern of people developing this illness. We don't have to have been exposed to chemicals or toxins in those environments, but if we've been exposed to some of the same chemicals, the authors write that may be the cause of our illnesses. So these include mixed volatile and semi-volatile organic compounds. So these are known as VOCs or SVOCs. Again, pesticides and combustion products. So these are the most common things that people have been exposed to that have led to the development of MCS, TILT, chemical intolerance. When it comes to synthetic organic chemicals and their combustion products, these include xylene, benzene, acetone were the primary ones. So mold is an important trigger for MCS, but many other things are also the culprit. In my case, it was pesticide. Okay. So Sam Fonte writes, why do you think it's taking so long for real change to happen when it comes to curbing or limiting the oversaturation of fragrances in everyday life? It's a complicated question. And we'll first turn to a response from listener Lisa Moe, and then I can talk about some things I found online. But Lisa Moe writes, just watch commercial television, see commercials in magazines, ads in magazines, movies, videos, TV shows with product placement. The marketing is relentless, brainwashing and addiction. It took many decades and many health officials speaking out to undo the same for tobacco use. So what are the roots of the saturation or oversaturation of fragrances in society? These have to, as far as I have found online in summary, they have to do with cultural norms and social pressure. So we live in culture, particularly in the West and beyond, where fragrance is very common. Perfume, scented products, laundry products, increasingly air fresheners. We're told through ads and marketing that these they make us more attractive, they make us cleaner, and they're an important part of taking care of our bodies. So when we ask people to be fragrance-free, this is something that is going against the grain of our current Western culture and other cultures. And as we know, people often don't respond well. And so what's behind all this marketing and product placement and just going to the grocery stores, we all see the prominent place that these scented chemical products have in our society. And that's because massively profitable and wealthy companies stand to gain profit from selling these. And they often stand in the way to adopting better regulations that could mean less harmful exposures and also the development of fragrance-free products. And of course, one of the questions that comes up again and again that I like to ask guests is, how could it possibly be that these products are mass marketed and sold to the masses when they're known to be harmful? We all know how harmful they are. How is it that fragrance can be written on a label when it really doesn't tell anything about what's inside the fragrance? So these are challenges and gaps when it comes to regulation. And it's also about the limited awareness of health impacts. I just had a conversation today with some of my neighbors who expressed to me that they had no idea that certain scented and chemical laundry detergents were harmful to health. So we may be there with tobacco smoke, but we have a long way to go when it comes to awareness about the health impacts of fragrance, don't we? And then there's the enforcement challenges, as we've talked about on this podcast. And as we all know, adopting a fragrance-free policy or fragrance awareness policy is one step, but really enforcing it and working with people to make it work is really complicated. It takes a long time. So so it's a combination of business, economic, culture, regulation, and societal norms. And so maybe we can just wrap up this little bit about what we can do to feel empowered, because sometimes it can really feel overwhelming, can't it? We can make decisions to be fragrance-free and in our homes as much as possible, make them as safe as possible. We can diplomatically as possible advocate and ask others. It's really difficult, I found, to get up the courage to ask. whether it's with family or friends or at work, at school. We can support fragrance-free products and brands with our dollars and cents, the way we shop, and share strategies among community and share our experiences in community as well. All right, Shelley D. Petit has a question. Shelley writes, in multiple large group settings, one thing I've noticed is that so many women who've developed MCS also struggle or did with severe endometriosis, PCOS, polycystic ovary syndrome. It's a common hormonal and metabolic disorder that affects people with ovaries, and it commonly begins when people are in their late teens or early 20s. I don't have a definition. Oh, and endometriosis is a chronic estrogen-dependent inflammatory disease characterized by the presence of endometrium-like tissue outside the uterus, which can cause pelvic pain, infertility, and systemic symptoms. Shelley writes, it's always struck me maybe develop worsening MCS around peri or menopause stage. Could there be a hormonal link? And so Kristen Kuchera writes, I've had hyperosmia for years, but MCS emerged in menopause. And EI Crusade shares, yes, I had undiagnosed endo and fibroids and got MCS in my late 30s. And AEM, I'm not sure which association that refers to, has a conference each year. We should write them to put this up as a topic. So I have found a brief summary. So yes, multiple chemical sensitivity. Frequently, we know it occurs more often in women, and with symptoms often occurring when women are in reproductive transition, when women are pregnant, experiencing perimenopause and menopause. So the hormones could play a role. Estrogen is known to sensitize mast cells and TRP receptors, which Dr. Molla, who's been on the podcast, talks about, which have a role in pain and detecting irritants, and mechanisms also active in endometriosis. So endometriosis is also involved in central sensitization, which has connections to other hypersensitivity syndromes. So in summary, the women with endometriosis or PCOS may experience immune, hormonal, and metabolic vulnerabilities that increase the risk of chemical intolerance, although no long-term studies have been conducted, and at the moment, there is not a proven causal link. But like anything when it comes to MCS, I really like the term citizen science. So when we, the people who have the illness, share information, share the deep knowledge that we have, women have gained through lived experience, and when we potentially ally with helpful, ethical researchers who value our experiences, we can collaboratively produce really important knowledge. There's another question from Cheryl Martin, and I think it's an important question and one that I have asked many guests, and I'll continue to ask them. The question is, why is it impossible to have transparency in the labeling of ingredients? And I'm assuming, Cheryl, you mean labeling, transparency in labeling when it comes to fragrance and chemicals in consumer products and personal care products. So what I have found in summary online is that in many parts of the world, fragrance is considered or can be regulated as a trade secret. So companies are not obligated to disclose what is in the fragrance. They can keep that confidential. They don't have to put it on labels. And that can mean concealing or not disclosing dozens, maybe even hundreds of individual chemicals that go into producing fragrance, what is also labeled often as parfum or other. And we've talked a bit about regulation. Often regulation laws haven't kept pace, and companies have the upper edge, and again are not forced to disclose, reveal the precise contents of fragrance. And there are influential lobby groups, connected to the fragrance industry, which influence the development of legislation, and often consumer health and well-being is not necessarily the priority. When it comes to disclosing what fragrances are made of, as I noted, and as we know, it could be hundreds of individual chemicals, and it might just not be practical, although I'd rather see it. I'm sure we'd rather see it. And along with lobby groups, companies, the industry has not been willing to date, because if they were to disclose their products, they're likely concerned about the repercussions of those, that people would make better choices or different choices. Companies may not necessarily know exactly what goes into their products because they could be bottled in one country. Something could be sourced from a different country, put together in another country, but it's possible that they may not know exactly what's in there. I think they need to find out, though, and do a better job. There are some parts of the world that do a better job obligating corporations to be transparent when it comes to fragrance labeling. And this is something that I often raise with guests and get their take on it. For example, if the European Union does a better job, why couldn't other countries follow suit? So EU is known to force companies, in some cases, to be more transparent, but there are still some ways companies get around it, particularly apparently when it comes to cleaning products in the EU. But it's, again, further ahead of North America in terms of transparency. Other countries and parts of the world that are more proactive, Norway, apparently, California, the United States, and Canada. But in Canada, where I'm based, labels can still, corporations can still list fragrance. It's kind of an umbrella term that doesn't really help us at all, does it? Japan is also known to be one of the more progressive countries when it comes to forcing companies to label more accurately. So another question from Fee Mick. So Fee asks, are there any recovery stories? How people got better from MCS? I'd love to know. And this is something that I think about sometimes, just to be completely transparent with you, a little bit reluctant to share recovery stories. And the only reason is, there's a couple of reasons. Sometimes it's because people who claim to be recovered from MCS, some people may have another agenda and they may be trying to sell a product or a service. And so I'm hesitant in some cases when my spidey senses are triggered, because some people reach out and contact me and they'd love to come on the podcast to talk about how they got better. And, I use my spidey senses a lot, intuition there. And also because MCS is, as we know, very complicated, and what works for someone might not necessarily work for others. And the other thing is, you may notice that I never dispense with medical advice on this podcast because it's not really what it's about. There are a lot of spaces where medical information, treatment, supplements, information is available. And we also share information from our own lived experiences on online platforms. But it's just not something that I do because I don't want to recommend anything and someone could be adversely affected. So that's not the nature of this podcast and why I do it. Do I believe people can be fully cured, if that's the word, or fully recover from MCS? I think all I know is in my own case, there have been times when I've been less reactive to toxins and times when I've been a lot more. So I do note that it ebbs and flows. A listener who is very well informed, Wendy Kearley, says it's a progressive illness. And I believe that if we're not mindful of what we're exposed to and not trying not to be exposed as much as possible, we can be affected much more seriously. But having said all that, I'm going to share one listener's comments. These comments come from Janice Martin. Janice writes, "We've had great success by purchasing the model home of the new housing addition. It had folks walking through it for 2 years with only a small office in the garage, so it had completely off-gas and it never had a water leak. The air quality was tested several ways and was the same inside as outdoors. Zero mold. I've been here 3.5 years. The house is now 5 years old. And I finally achieved remission from CIRS. I don't know what CIRS is 1.5 years ago, after 9 years of struggle with no success. Another helpful quality of this property is that it's on a hill and breezes blow through the house and across the back porch. I'm turning 70 in 2 months and feel better, less restricted, more energetic than I have since my 20s. I'm able to travel by myself, which I couldn't do for years. I also went back to work as a personal chef and cook for folks in my situation. So here's a definition of CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. And CIRS is a distinct condition. It's not the same as multiple chemical sensitivity. It's defined as chronic inflammatory response syndrome, where systemic inflammation occurs after exposure to biotoxins, most often mold, and it could be a genetic predisposition. So it could cause symptoms that are similar to MCS, but they're not the same condition necessarily. So I'm not an expert. I'm not a physician. I'm not a medical researcher. And I'm not sure if, Janice Martin, you have MCS, but you write that you've had some success in getting better from CIRS. Kyla Joy Padilla writes, I'm curious if MCS is part of why there are strange side effects to medications. And Kyla Joy Padilla writes, I'm the side effect queen. So do people with MCS react to medication? And listener Rosemary McDonald has a similar parallel question because, without disclosing too much information, was prescribed or recommended a medication and writes, I'm not sure how sensitive people go about using these products or medications. And I think these are very good questions. And many listeners will know that people who have MCS often have reactions to supplements and medications. And these can often trigger reactions in individuals who are sensitive. So I'm not going to respond to the question of the specific medicine because I don't want to reveal personal information about your condition. But yes, people with MCS can have heightened sensitivity to medication, and it can be really difficult. I've seen, and you may have seen, someone posting online in Facebook groups fairly regularly about trying to find an antidepressant that doesn't cause a reaction. So it's a very difficult situation to be in, where one could potentially benefit from medication, in this case, an antidepressant, not from the listener who wrote in, but from the person I mentioned who commented online. And for all kinds of conditions, these are real questions that many of us have about how to, for example, if we ever need chemotherapy, if we ever need to take prescription medication, how we're going to do that. I know in my case, I try to, when it comes to medication, get the most natural kind without any preservatives or dyes. Others online I've seen have recommended going to compound pharmacies as much as possible. Others have recommended starting at very low doses just to try and keeping an eye out for reactions, but it's not easy. Yvette Caro, whom I mentioned before, listener writes, I've always wondered why or how different chemicals or compounds affect my body differently, a completely different reaction and symptoms. Is this true for all of us? So what I've found is that we can respond differently to different chemicals in different ways. And one thing that fascinates me is the range of reactions that people report online, the number of systems in the body that are affected, and the reactions can be very different. And that's because of our individual biologies and the compounds, the chemical structures, how these interact with your receptors in the body, with tissues, with enzymes, the pathways in which they enter the body, the state of our nervous system, our hormonal conditions, if that's the way to say it, the level of inflammation, genetics, the gut microbiome, other existing health conditions and prior exposures. All of this can, I'm reading, lead to different reactions. Makes sense, right? So there isn't really one universal reaction. We all react in different ways, and many systems of the body react in different ways. I had a question that comes up for me in my mind fairly frequently, and some people call MCS fragrance allergy. And I've known for some time that, like you, that MCS is not an allergy, but I don't, because I'm not a scientist, I'm not a physician or a medical researcher. I don't know why that is, why it isn't. So I reached out to Dr. John Malot, who is a physician based in Ontario, in Canada, who's a specialist in multiple chemical sensitivities. And I asked, why is MCS not considered an allergy? And he very kindly responded. An allergy is a very specific reaction by the immune system involving antibodies called immunoglobulin E or IgE. This is how allergists define an allergic reaction. These specific allergic reactions are not involved in the sensitization to chemicals except under specific conditions, such as a skin rash on physical contact. The sensitization to chemicals seen in MCS involves a different reaction, namely the sensitization of chemical sensors called TRP receptors that exist mainly on cell surfaces, especially in the nervous system. All right, so I hope that's helpful. Another really important question on getting a diagnosis and medical support. So I'm turning to listeners as I am for a lot of these questions. And Chantel Kirk kindly writes, I read about or the bio section of medical practitioners online. Having a military background has been helpful as more awareness of chemical injuries. I believe Chantel's referring to physicians who may have a military background. If I'm misinterpreting that, please correct me. Chantel also writes, applied kinesiology practitioners have been the best for her as far as testing and acute treatment. P. Renee in Australia writes, never met a decent doctor. The ladies at the patch testing clinic are my current heroes. It took 6 years of persistence, 3 on a waiting list, and another 3 years and 6 months of dermatology clinic visits to get a referral for patch testing. Patch testing confirmed multiple chemical allergies. So I read everything. I seek to understand the biological processes and chemical interplays. What I take away from your comments, your sharing, Pia, is that, yeah, we often do rely on our own lived experience and wisdom, and we often do have a lot of knowledge. Steve Chalmers writes, his family's policy of never discussing MCS with a mainstream physician, much less pushing hard for solutions that physicians simply aren't equipped to provide, left our records clean enough that when presenting it with a difficult, life-threatening gray area complaint, we got taken seriously. I wish the world wasn't this way. Obviously, the medical profession in the world are in much better shape for dealing with or working with people, assisting people with MCS than they were 20 years ago when our journey began. A couple more questions, important questions, difficult questions. The question came in about medical assistance in dying. And I open this up for listeners to share thoughts, whether people have thoughts on medical assistance in dying. I know it's not universally accessible. It's accessible in Canada. Someone with MCS, at least one person with MCS chose to die this way. So there are conflicting views on it. And so that's what I want to share with you. Sherry Roseberg writes, I never thought I would, and this is completely difficult to admit, but in recent years, I've considered it, even to the point of filling out the paperwork. I haven't pursued it any further as yet, but I do think about it. Despite medical assistance in dying being the only solution my mind comes up with for periods of time, as an end to the torturous pain and suffering I've had to keep enduring on a daily basis, I do not actually want to die. I won't get into my long history with MCS or all the reasons why I've lost so much hope recently, but I'll say that a huge part of it does involve the devastatingly huge lack of safe, affordable housing options for those of us with MCS. So yes, 100%, I agree. More safe housing and resources should be made available, something we definitely, desperately need. And Steve Chalmers, he writes, I support the existence of MAID with the correct controls, not killing the disabled and not locking out someone for whom it's appropriate. And Shelley D. Petit writes, absolutely, and it's no one's business or right to tell me otherwise. We have a question from an anonymous listener, and the question is this: how do I spend time with my daughters when they live at college where fragrance is now saturated into everything they own? When I just go anyway, I'm so ill? That's a really difficult question. And if we extend it, how do we spend time with people in our lives when fragrance is present or prevalent, when it's a big problem for us? Diane Perry, listener, writes, I use my 3M personal air purifying respirator or PAPR whenever I'm going anywhere that will be a trigger. We have an episode on the podcast where two women with MCS talk about their lived experiences using those. And you can find that at chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org and on the podcast YouTube channel. Here's an important question from a listener whose name I don't have on hand. It's about options, those of us with MCS who will need institutional or home care as we age. Something I'm sure many listeners think about, certainly something I think about. Steve Chalmers writes, to my knowledge, there's no viable nursing home or assisted living which is MCS safe. Sandy Johansson writes, I'm 80 and still extremely self-reliant. I once knew a woman 10 years ago, older than me, that struggled. She had government housing and someone had to help and check on her. I know it was very difficult that she was continually exposed to toxins. I intend to stay in the system for as long as I can for many years to come. I think we're going to end on one question, which is the following: how to create and deliver information about MCS and toxic household chemicals for people who don't have MCS. So I turned to Linda Tabor, who goes by Linda is in the house on social media, because Linda is an advocate and very creative in her use of social media to communicate really important information about MCS. And Linda kindly responded. My initial response is to try to make it as short and succinct as possible, since attention spans are so short nowadays. Think of elevator speech length, although I still struggle with that big time with my wordy self unless I'm creating a meme that has visuals that help paint a picture that doesn't need as many words. And I use Canva to make that content like that. Ideally, whoever we're trying to deliver the information to has to want and be open to learn and be willing to enact changes. It's best to read the room to better gauge what delivery system would work best for each situation. Sadly, it's backfired on some folks in various ways, just as much as it's helped others. Be sure to share facts versus feelings so they have something to reference if they decide to dive deeper into the subject. And that's where the Fragrance Free Coalition printable handouts and posters are so handy to keep on hand. So the Fragrance Free Coalition is a group, and they have a Facebook group. I encourage you to check them out, as well as any other relevant handouts you can find or create. Of course, you can share direct experiences to personalize it to the level you feel comfortable with, depending on the audience. Try to explain in ways that compare real life scenarios that most folks will likely understand. For example, comparing each scented product being used to a lit cigarette. Or when folks say only use light scents, let them know that's just like blowing smoke in your face and saying it was from a Marlboro Light instead of a Marlboro Red. Or let them know that none of the added fragrance chemicals essentials do anything to improve the efficacy of a product, but instead only add layers of pollutants to the air, surfaces they're applied to, bodies they're used on, etc. Or let them know how unnaturally potent essential oils and chemicals are, fragrance is, and they should never be used casually. I wish I had a basic, simple answer that would cover all the bases we need to cover, as we have to continually advocate for ourselves, but it takes a variety of methods and messages. Thank you so much to Linda Tabor for this very comprehensive answer, and for everyone who shared questions and who shared responses. Really appreciate it. If you'd like to send in further questions, we can do this again, and I will reach out to experts. I'll reach out to you and ask for more answers. So thanks so much for listening and watching, and we'll talk again soon. You've been listening to the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. Please share your feedback about this episode on social media, and you can reach me at aaron@chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. Please subscribe where you get your podcasts and leave a review. It helps others find the podcast. And a friendly reminder, I'd love your help. I'm running a short listener survey to understand how the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast can best serve folks with MCS. It's short, help guide our next steps, and allow us to grow the podcast and create greater awareness about multiple chemical sensitivity. You can find a link to the survey on the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast Facebook group. Thanks so much for taking part. Really appreciate it. You've been listening to the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast. I'm the podcast creator, Aaron Goodman. The Chemical Sensitivity Podcast is by and for the MCS community. The podcast is generously supported by the Marilyn Brockman Hoffman Foundation and listeners like you. If you wish to support the podcast, please visit chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. Your support will help us continue making the podcast available and creating greater awareness about MCS. To learn more about the Chemical Sensitivity Podcast, follow the podcast on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, and TikTok. And you can reach me by email at aaron@chemicalsensitivitypodcast.org. And if you'll please take a moment to complete our listener survey. It's short and a chance to help shape resources for the MCS community. The link's in the show notes. Thanks so much. The Chemical Sensitivity Podcast and its associated website are the work of Aaron Goodman and made possible with funds from the Marilyn Brockman Hoffman Foundation, supporting efforts to educate and inform physicians, scientists, and the public about multiple chemical sensitivity. The content, opinions, findings, statements, and recommendations expressed in this Chemical Sensitivity Podcast and associated website do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of its sponsors.